Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank. It's a special episode, but we're missing our contestant that's in this race today. But I'm here with Steve from Spartan History. Welcome back, brother man.
G'day, Robbie. Lovely to see you again, sir. How are you?
It's, I was stressing because this is probably, I don't usually do more than two people in a Zoom call. And usually it's hard to find that synchronicity. If you get I can't just randomly pull one academic and then pull another academic who've never met each other. One studies anthropology or one studies culture or whatever. It's not going to go well. But I guess here comes our third contestant right here, Mark. See if I can admit him in. But it's going to be a kind of mishmash of cultures when it comes to Rome, and then also comes to Greece as well too, because as much as you study Spartan history, you also like the Rome history aspect of things as well too. And then Mark kind of knows, because I mean they go hand in hand. They're both. Mark, what's up? Welcome to the show.
Hey, Robbie. Hey, Steve. How you going?
I was we're recording, but I started this because I didn't want this to come I was kind of giving an intro. You know how I like my intros. I'm either you like me or you think I'm weird. It's okay, but we're going to ride it together. But with this podcast, I wanted to specifically not make it a debate, not make it any type of talking things, but I just wanted to talk about, because you guys both do podcasts about ancient history and you guys focus in kind of two different realms. Even though Spartan history is still a part of ancient Greece, it is a completely different side, more of like a bit of Roman culture to it compared to how the Greece were all about literature and the innovations and the stuff that we kind of use today. I just wanted to get your guys' perspectives of why you guys love and you guys decided to do the podcast in it. And then also if we can talk about some of the differences and also some similarities where one might seem better than the other. Because if you asked me, what would fit society's standards today? Like if you took everyone from today's society and put them in one of these cultures, the one that would be manageable probably to survive in would be the Greece aspect of things because of the way they viewed things. More like you could have a talk back to a power a little bit compared to in Rome, where they would just slice your head off or stick you on a stick. And I think this is important because it also looks at decision-making of problems that we face today, bring those problems and put it in more of an older time period, and you start to see how things would unravel either similarly or differently.
Wow. Robbie, as always, you give us 1,000 things to kick things off with, but I guess for myself, I was originally going to do a Rome history podcast, but to do a Rome history podcast, you've got to contend with the big guns in the field, your Mike Duncans and the likes like that. But by far and away, Rome has obviously captured the popular ideal in people's mind, but in lieu of doing something like that, I decided to go something very specialist. And I'd always had a fascination with the Spartan society, their militaristic dominance of Greece in the 5th and 4th centuries. So I thought I'd sort of narrow down and go deep dive on something. So I chose the Spartan History Podcast.
Mark?
Yeah, and so I mean, I've been studying history for quite a long time, probably 15 years or so. My interest basically peaked after high school. High school, I wasn't very interested in anything at school itself, but everything came about afterwards. But I spent many years just looking in all aspects of history. I went modern history all the way, and finally, I got driven to ancient history due to a friend of mine who was doing ancient history through university, and he did mention, you've got to read. I think the first book he actually mentioned was Polybius. And so I did read that. And then he said, you've got to read Herodotus. And basically after reading Herodotus, I was hooked on ancient Greece. I did sort of stray away and start continuing with other sort of time periods, but I kept finding myself being drawn back to ancient Greece for some reason. And I guess I was also drawn with all my other history was, I guess, the military history aspect of it too is what got me into a lot of it. But I found with Greece, it was more than that. It just felt like there was other layers to the history that I was really interested in. And I think it did come to being able to draw it to modern day, how so many aspects are connected to what we do today, how we think, our institutions, and things like that. So I found myself deciding to do something on ancient Greece, and I wanted to take it further. So I created the podcast.
Well, do you like more of the religious aspect? Do you like more of the literature aspect? And this question is for both of you. Or do you like more of because I look at, like, for instance, me, if you put me in that time period back then, if you asked me to choose whether ancient Greece or, Roman, I wouldn't survive in the Roman one because I know how I am. I know a lot of their brutality are things that I don't appreciate, even though, I mean, I appreciate it, but not in an aspect I'd want to live in it. I mean, I'm not going to do anything illegal, but at the same time, it's kind of like in Egypt. If you stole something, you got your hand chopped off. And it's like, well, what do we count as stealing? But the Olympic Games is usually what's referenced when it comes to like the Greeks, for instance. But Romans were obviously a little bit more athletic because their pursuit and their mindset was more about military standards. But if you look at like the construct of like, I'm more like, I'm not religious, but I like the fairy tale religious aspect of things. Mostly about how they viewed the gods, but then you start to look at how they view the underworld. And this question I think is on everybody's minds usually is what happens when you die? Now, I don't know if you go to a place in the sky or you go to some underworld, you go something like this. And the Romans had a different aspect of what the underworld was, which I started to appreciate a little bit more the more I dived into it.
Yeah, look, I think to answer your initial part, you can fall into the habit of, I guess, assuming that the Romans were, and with the Romans, it stands true that they were largely a homogenous culture, even post the imperial period where, the empire expanded a great deal, but the central governance and law came from Rome itself. And most of the populations, no matter how far removed of Rome, were incredibly proud to call themselves Romans. The Greeks never had that. And in fact, the idea of Pan-Hellenism or Greekness is a relatively modern one that sort of took root in the 19th century when the Greeks were attempting to throw off the yoke of the Ottomans at the time. But in ancient times, it was an incredibly rare thing for the Greeks to come together as one sort of entity. And it was only at times of great crisis. I think if you look at the Greco-Persian Wars as one of the few times they came together. And we're looking at, I think Mark could probably speak better to this. He's just finished a large period of his podcast on this part, but at most it was 30 Greek cities out of a possible 1,000 cities that came together as the one society. So you've got to be careful when you think about the Greeks as Greeks. They were Athenians, or they were Spartans, or they were Thebans or Corinthians, whereas the Romans were largely Roman in their mindset and in their practice and in their pragmatism, whereas the Greeks were very individual and unique. And in that uniqueness, the Spartans and the Athenians stood out, not just in the historical record, but definitely by their practices as well. Mark?
Yeah, so from what I understand is, I guess Rome is more how we'd recognize a country today, where you are part of a larger civilization and a larger entity. Whereas in ancient Greek times, like Steve says, you were predominantly an Athenian or Spartan or Corinthian, depending what city you were from. And the whole idea of a whole Greek nation was just not in anyone's mind back then. You did have the whole Pan-Hellenism that was spoken about, but that was very, very weak and loose. And like I've covered in the Greek and Persian Wars, you find, I think it's 31 city-states that try to come together to fight against the Persians. And you've got a whole lot more that are siding or submitting to the Persians as they come through. But then you've got a greater number that are just standing on the sidelines just because it's perhaps not directly affecting them at the time. And you see many a times, even with the 31 Greek city-states that came together, there was a number of times where everything could have just broken down. It was everything held together very. It was on a knife edge. The cooperation, because you still had two, I guess, power blocks still developing, where you had different interests at stake. So you had all the city states on the Peloponnese that had their own interests, but then everyone else north of the Peloponnese had different interests, where they were more interested in taking the fight to the Persians in the early stages because it was their lands that were going to be invaded first. Whereas the Peloponnesians had a fallback, where you had the little narrow strip of land where the Corinthian Isthmus is, which was like a natural choke point where they saw that as a good defensive position. But so you had conflicting interests, and trying to maintain that alliance was very, very difficult. And I think the whole Pan-Hellenism is more of a modern sort of construct, and the importance around that is perhaps more in our modern times.
Absolutely.
Well, if we pull a lot of our ideas from Greece when it comes to literature, when it comes to law, when it comes to, I mean, a lot of essential functions that society kind of bases off of today, we wouldn't have without the Greece culture. But if you look at like the expression of creativity in the Greece aspect, do you think a lot of that is maybe a concept of they weren't as, I guess, hive minded? It seems like the Roman culture was a lot more hive minded because all that mattered was like the power of Rome, the strength, and kind of these basic things where written down in history sounds pretty amazing. But when you look at it now in this context of what we view society has changed, where it kind of seems demonic or evil or barbaric in a way. I know the Rome sometimes gets labeled a little bit as the barbaric culture compared to Greece seems more like the influence of innovation. You know, you see Aristotle or all these people that get referenced as philosophers. It seems like this great age of thinking, and I start boiling it down to the concept of how me and you guys have usually talked separately in my podcast, which is about the influence of thought. When you feel like you don't have the ceiling, it lets your thoughts expand out more and it allows the door open for creativity. If you're not fearful of being killed for something that you do, something I read was that in Greece, a lot of the Greece stuff would talk about the king or maybe joke or throw a jab as like a little pun or a fun friend thing to do. And there really wasn't any kind of repercussions for it. But it seems like in Rome, that's a different style of culture. It's like trying to crack a joke about someone who you don't know. They're going to take offense to it. And in Rome, it was more seen like you're showing signs of weakness, or maybe you're throwing a jab, and not a lot of people were about that. They were more about fighting, or they were more about building morale and a sign of strength when it came to their armies. And in Greece, morale was a concept of the innovations or the beauty that you can kind of think of. You know, they did try and expand. Obviously, Greece was a powerful force, but that also is kind of stretching yourself a little bit too thin when it came down to its collapse, when Rome was able to build upon war upon war upon war and strengthen in that sense.
Yeah, look, I guess there's probably two Romes to talk about as well. There's the pre-imperial period where it was largely Republican. You had a body of senators that were the upper echelons of power, and look, the Senate was still around after the emperor had taken office, I guess, throughout the imperial period. But by and large, the Romans that we refer to are only a very, very small subset of the population, and similar in Greece to the Greeks that we're talking about when we're talking about the ancient Greeks are also the real upper echelons of society, whether it's the Athenian aristocracy or it's the Spartan homoioi class, or any sort of form of oligarchy throughout the place. But I think I read once that the Romans were incredibly introspective but outward looking in their view of the world, whereby they looked for a lot of their power and dynamism was coming from within, and they looked to enforce upon the rest of the world the Roman will. Whereas the Greeks were incredibly extroverted in their disposition, but very inward looking when it came to developing their architecture, obviously, and their city state and things like that. And I think part of what you say there is definitely true. The Romans drew their morale from their record of victories in battle, the dominion of Rome across the Mediterranean. Whereas for the Greeks, it was more about pride in one's city state, and also to touch on, you mentioned the afterlife as well. The Greeks didn't really so much believe in a happy-go-lucky heaven where all you need to do was leave a decent life and apologize. The Greeks largely believed that when you died, the only thing that you remembered by were your deeds in life. So for the Greeks, it was more of a matter of how you were going to be remembered would dictate how you were going to perform on the battlefield. It wasn't so much a morale thing, but you didn't want to be remembered in Hades as a loser. You don't want to be remembered as a brave man that took his weapons in the front. That's probably the key differences to answer your question from my point of view.
And I think, okay, full disclosure here too, it's been a long time since I've really studied Roman history. So
am I wearing a lab jacket? I'm not a scientist.
I'm very hazy on a lot of the details, but I'll do my best. But I think another aspect is you've got to think about the timeline here as well. So, and Steve mentioned that they were like the Greeks were very outward looking, and they would take in other cultures, because you would find early on, say in the archaic sort of age around 8th, 7th century BC, a lot of the innovation and ideas were actually coming from not within Greece itself, but over in Anatolia. So you had a lot of Greek colonies that were set up. And this is where you see the birth of a lot of thought and different styles of discipline, and it seems to, I guess, be learning from other cultures too. So you had a lot of the cultures from within the Near East and even down in Egypt, a lot of aspects come into Greek culture and influence how things develop. And then it's later that mainland Greece starts rising importance and taking over, and the Ionians, they end up becoming subject to Lydians and then the Persians. But a lot of the ideas transfer over into mainland Greece. And then I guess you've got Rome, which then comes along. It's developing as it is on the peninsula. It's only quite a small city by that stage of classical Greece. But by the time that they come into Greece, they're coming into like a fully fledged civilization that has all these developed ideas that then get absorbed into their own culture, but then it's mixing with what they've developed over their centuries as well. So I think it's a mixture of, and I guess in Rome too, you see them. I think Athens and Greece is often centered as the cultural sort of capital of Rome, isn't it? Later in Rome's history.
Well, like,
yeah, absolutely.
When I had to remember this because I had to save it on my phone, because first podcast I probably ever took notes for. I know that it says like Greek art is technically considered superior, merely because it was more like of an aspiring of what you should be or what the ideal would be, and Roman art was more realistic. I mean, I'm basing my questions off things that I enjoy, more like when we look at culture, for instance, a lot of these Greek statues, or everyone has one of these ones that's missing an arm inside of their home. The ideal beauty of things. I like the concept of the stretch for thought that Greece culture has really offered. When you look at Roman culture, was more about realisticness. And in a sense, obviously based on the time period, it's not going to be super 100% identical to what real is, compared if we talk about underworld, if there is a heaven or a hell. But it to me, like when I look at like the concepts of why you guys appreciate them, why you enjoy them, I'm wondering if you had to choose between Greece or Rome, both of you guys, which one would you choose to live in, or which one do you think you would survive in? Because from my aspect of things, I don't think I would survive in Roman culture, even though I like athletics. I like the whole presence of it, but I don't know if that's a construct of the society that we grew up in or the society that we're from. I mean, 50 years ago or 40 years ago or 30 years ago is completely different from the time period now. My generation versus your guys' generation, it's completely different. So maybe you guys might have a different viewpoint about if you could survive in Roman culture, or do you think Greeks would be better?
It's the ultimate question, like, and it's one of those ones that gets bandied around all the time too, like what's better? Greece is who would win on the battlefield? Surely the Romans with their legions, and who had the better art, who had the better architecture? It's the question that just keeps on giving. You can sit here and talk about it for absolute hours, but there's just so much disparity between any comparison you're going to make. Look, personally, if I was to have the choice of any life in the ancient time, it'd be very hard to go past to be in the senatorial class of ancient Rome, simply because you had the world literally at your feet. You had the benefits of the education from all the cultures. Say if you put yourself in the 1st century BCE, say around the birth of Julius Caesar, for example, maybe a little later, actually, no, maybe not so much later, around about there, before there was massive civil wars and things like that, you could get the education from a Greek, rhetoric teacher. You could have a Syrian teaching mathematics. You had the benefit of all these different sorts of education. You had food being pumped into the Mediterranean and fed into the Roman breadbasket from all corners of there. You'd have, materials being imported from very exotic marble deposits littered throughout northern Africa and throughout Greece. You'd have a beautiful place to live in. You'd have 1,000 servants at your beck and call. It would truly be an idealized existence. And before the advent of electricity and the modern sort of luxuries that we have now, I would suggest that there's probably no better person to be in the ancient world than a Roman senator. You wouldn't catch me being a Spartan. As much as I would love to, see what the guys lived like back then, there's no way in the world I would survive the agoge, the education process, and nor would I want my son to go through it. And Athens was an incredibly tough city to live in as well. To be an aristocrat in that city, for sure, that would be something. Obviously, you'd have some slaves as well who would look after you. But no, I'd personally want to be a Roman senator if I had my choice.
Yeah. So, I'm just going to have to say Greece because I just, my detail on Rome is going to make me too. I'm not going to be able to form a good idea on it. But yeah, like Steve says, in the Greek world, where you end up or live would be very dependent on which city you're talking about, and even which time period, and what sort of government system you're under, because the Greeks it wasn't like Rome where you had like an autonomous government that governed the whole region or empire. You had all your different city-states would have different governing systems, like oligarchies and tyrannies and democracy that came along. And I guess you would have somewhat sort of monarchies in some areas as well. So it really, and then depending what class you're in, is how well you would fare in a lot of those places as well. I always like to think it's maybe this is because of the lack of information that's in the sources on certain small islands, but it'd be just the idealized place to sort of live almost out of the mainstream political world in ancient Greece, where you live in like a small community on an island somewhere in the Aegean. Sounds like it would be something quite nice to do, but obviously you're dealing with none of the modern comforts that we have today. But yeah, I think so. When you talk about that sort of thing, I think it's really dependent on where you're talking about and what time period you're talking about, because there'll be some areas where it'd be absolutely horrendous. And like Steve said, I don't think I'd be wanting to live in Sparta from a personal point of view.
You got to remember, Robbie, for the 99.99% of people in the ancient world, it would have been an absolutely terrible life to have. I mean, if you were the guy at the top sitting on the Acropolis looking down on the Athenians, then that's the guy you want to be. Or you're a Roman, who's got a seat on the Senate House. That's the dude. Or to be fair, even a Spartan, a red cloaked Spartan, probably wouldn't be the best place to be. But it'd be far better off than being one of the indentured Helot slaves working the fields, for example. But for the vast majority of people in the ancient world, you wouldn't trade a moment of your life in the modern era for that.
That was literally the point I was leading into, which was the concept of, we look at how we would base our survival based on if we had a good position, but how hard was it to get a good position? It's kind of like you're born into it in a sense. You don't just get lucked right into those things. I mean, speaking from an average base level, do you think it was community aspect? Do you think it was an overall love and admiration for the people around you based on Greece or Rome? Or do you think it was more of a fear aspect of things as well too? Now we get the poor aspect if we look from a beggar or we look from a slave aspect of things. It was not an easy or fun time to survive in either time period. But looking at more of like how we have today, where we have wealth disparities amongst poor people versus rich people, it was more of an easier concept to survive, not on the aspect of war, not on the aspect of just only on wealth standards. Do you think it was an easy aspect for people to be able to get a source of food? Do you think it was more of like you had to make sure that if you could be a hunter in Rome, it seems like if you could at least go out and fight and kill for your food, you're going to eat fine. But how many people had those essential aspects of going to be able to hunt? Was the average person in Greece able to know how to kill or find food, or would they had to use other aspects to get their food across? Then how easily accessible was that? Because I think we get stuck on the basis of whenever we start to daydream or think of this, we end up putting ourselves in a senator position, or we put ourselves like, if I were president or if I were the leader, your life would be really easy, because that's what all the movies kind of show. They show a person rising from beggar to a war asset or to some type of higher position, this grind to get up there. But they never truly stick on the basis of being what they would call lower level or lower class, and base a whole movie off of that. So all of our ideal aspects happen to be like, well, then we can get to this position and we'll have all this. Well, daydreaming's cool. I would love to have $1 billion and then ride around in a Ferrari, but at the same time, it's not probably going to happen. So like I said, probably on that. I just had to throw that in there. But the aspect of where I'm at now, would I be able to live the base level worker life and not be completely miserable? I mean, another question that also adds on to this that you guys can answer separately is the suicide rates. Do you think that there was a lot of contemplating your own existence or where you would go once you die in Roman and Greece culture? Was there this aspect of why maybe everybody was so fascinated with the underworld was because everyone had thoughts about death? Everyone not only thought about randomly getting killed, but maybe ending their own life because it seems so impossible to be able to live. I wonder, with the identity crisis that we experience today, and kind of there's notes of it in the past, if people had these dark thoughts, because I think That's a good question to help people today understand, is that this isn't a new thing as well. You know, I'm all about that. Like, it's not new. There's notes of it littered throughout history.
Yeah, Mark.
Yeah. So I think to do with I wouldn't have a clue about the suicide rates. I mean, this is something you don't really find in the sources. I mean, now and again, you hear about people that committed suicide, but it was they thought they dishonored themselves or something like that. But just when it comes to everyday society, it's not something that it really comes out in the sources. But I do wonder, I wonder if it would have been a lower rate, because nowadays where we're told, I guess with, say, a lot of religions, it's all about the afterlife. It's almost like a better being in the end afterwards. Whereas in the Greek world, once you died, you were died. It was like nothingness. You wandered the afterlife. There was no kingdom of heaven or anything like this. It was I guess a very mundane emptiness once you did die. So I guess there was no looking forward to what, I mean, no matter how terrible your life was, were you really looking to escape it to nothingness?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, precisely.
Yeah. In Rome culture, for instance, like Steve was talking about, like the great end, which is like this, place. I feel like with Roman culture, for instance, the idea that there is a better afterlife kind of is like Valhalla in Norse mythology. You're a lot more willing to go into war knowing that there's an endless feast and all this endless thing. I think that might have been an incentive for them to think this way, because you don't want to just waste your life that you have on this earth, when in their aspect was there's a better one right after. And I think that shows the more war focus compared to maybe Greece, for instance, which was seen as like nothingness. Is like, you got to do what you got to do here, because there might not be that end, or there might not be that extra place where you get a luxurious bounty of food, or you get to hunt for all eternity. There might not be that aspect.
Well,
yeah,
if
look,
I could just,
sorry, you go. Yeah.
Look, I was just going to add something else in there when you were just talking about that. Is not so much to do with suicide, but it was that concept where not so much the afterlife that you would experience, but it was more, I guess it's sort of going back a bit further than classical Greece, but it was the aspect of earning yourself like there's never-ending glory, so your name would be spoken about for the ages, and so that's what you were searching for, was to live on in the land of the living, so to speak. You may be dead, but your name would go on for the ages, and that was kind of a concept that a lot of people found very something that they wanted to chase.
Yeah, definitely. I think if you wound up with your name, being sung by a rhapsode like Homer, and you wound up, inscribed on an Iliad or something like that, there could be no better afterlife for an ancient Greek. And I guess the Elysian Fields is probably what you're referencing there, Robbie, which is I guess the paradise for warriors at the end of a Roman soldier's life. And yeah, certainly it was something that was idealized, but it was in a lot of senses it was no different to the Greeks' concept of the afterlife as well. There wasn't really a corporal sense of yourself over there. Like you were believed to have gone to a place that was, where you'd find rest and where you'd find peace, and it was the fitting reward to a warrior's life, earned and fought well. But there wasn't like a heaven. I think when Mark touched on Christianity, it's a good point. I've heard it spoken that Christianity was really the death of the warrior spirit in the Mediterranean. In particular, it really did carve a sway through the Roman Empire, and their ability to muster strong armies to be able to fight off hordes of barbarians, because once this all-seeing, all-knowing, and all-powerful God came along, who promised you the opportunity of an afterlife, and to get that you didn't need to perform great deeds on a battlefield. You didn't need to be really, loyal to the emperor or anything other than the Lord himself. And once the greater bulk of the population within Rome started converting to Christianity, and it happened more and more from the 2nd and 3rd and 4th centuries onwards, in particular into the 4th century, where Constantine consecrated the Roman Empire as a Christian one. You really saw that the Roman ability to fight large scale battles drop off, more increasingly from that time onwards. Most of their armies were made up by people that lived outside of the Roman borders. They were brought within Rome. They were trained by Roman generals to fight in the Roman style, and they adopted Roman tactics, and therefore they turned what they learned from the Romans against them, ultimately bringing the Romans down in the 5th century in the Western Empire. It took a lot longer in the East, but it was definitely Christianity and that thought of a paradise after life that really took a dent to the Romans. Before that, it was all blood. It was, give the peasants gladiatorial games. We want to see blood on the sand. We want an emperor, slitting people's throats, and we want blood. We want war. We want fighting. That was definitely how the Romans kept their bellicosity up. But Christianity definitely dampened it down.
Do you think more of the society, instead of looking at it as a strength, but do you think it was more riddled with deceit coming from the Rome aspect, or maybe even the Greece? Maybe it's kind of like living in a fantasy, or maybe brainwashing in a more modern term sense. I'm just curious on your guys' thoughts as that as well too. Do you think, for instance, like I know with Rome that the Colosseum has I think it was, what's their death count? Like over 200,000 possible people that could have been killed inside the Rome Colosseum. So I'm looking at it. Is it a fear aspect? Is it a deceit aspect? It seemed like, if you only got in trouble, but then it was turned into a glorious thing when you fought in a Colosseum, when you got to have all these people cheering your name. Yeah, sure. Maybe some of them were slaves, or most of them might've been slaves, but it was also like a sense of accomplishment. I mean, the champion was fed much like Wagyu beef is, where it's kind of like royalty in a sense. So I look at it as a concept of, do you think that it ended up shifting the thoughts of people when it came to maybe fighting or military aspects, maybe in a sense of honor? Do you think it was more of a deceitfulness? And then with the Greece aspect as well too, the shift of working hard and being an upper class or being a part of royalty, the power starts to shift towards more of the creative mindset, where philosophers started kind of taking the main stage and are the ones that we are talking about today. You might know the emperors or whoever was ruling of that time period if you study it, but the people and the motivational posters, they're quotes from philosophers from that age, the people that have literally lasted throughout history. And a lot of the ideas that we live by today are on a concept of those beliefs as well too, and those innovations.
Yeah, I think, and this is something I think we spoke about last week, was that in history you tend to hear of, I guess, the larger than life figures. You hear of the important leaders, the important battles, and whatever else. But when it comes to the everyday person, they're very rarely mentioned. But and to go back to one of your other points too, with I guess you were kind of comparing wealth as well. And I think in ancient Greece, it's not so much that case where today someone makes a lot of money and they become quite important in society, but it was more about your name and your family line, where you came from. Because you find in Greece, even as the classical period goes on, you get people that rise up from the bottom classes through wealth, and they're still looked down upon. They're not of noble birth, whereas in the earlier parts of Greek history, it was the nobles that were controlling society. When it was kind of like an oligarchic system, it's when democracy came along that more power was given to the people, and they had more opportunities to rise up and make money. But they were still not seen as the as an important class in that aspect. So I think money, though, having said that, people at the top are going to have much more opportunity to make money as well. But when it comes down to it, the money wasn't the central point that made someone important. It was their family lineage that really mattered.
Yeah, it was precisely the same in Rome as well. It was predominantly a landed aristocracy that extended back to the time of the kings in the 7th century. And when Rome as a republic was founded, the very first council of elders, or the senatorial class, were made up of patricians, and the patricians were the original landholders. And what you see over the next 400 years is a political struggle between the haves, I guess, and the have-nots. Not the haves of money and the have-nots. Both classes were equally wealthy, but it was definitely getting the entitlement for the plebeians, whereby the patricians originally had all of the government offices held within themselves. And after a series of revolts and storm-offs by the plebs, especially in early Rome, they were eventually granted a little bit more political enfranchisement. But even later on in the Republic, everything changed after the imperial times. When most people talk about Rome, you're talking about the Republic in Rome. Even in Caesar's time, there was a very famous general who was in fact Caesar's I believe it would be his uncle through marriage, Gaius Marius. Now, he rose to the venerable ranks of the consulship, but he was from a town named, I think it's Arpinium, which is about 12 kilometers to the south of Rome. And because he wasn't of true Roman stock, he was called a novus homo, or a new man in English, if you translate it. And even though he was, largely one of the two most important people in the Rome, with he and his co-consul, he was always derided by the true-blooded plebeians and the patricians. So, and Gaius Marius was extremely wealthy. He set his praetorship in Spain. He had it under his direct control, some silver mines over there and some tin mines. So he was very wealthy. But all the money that he had in the world didn't give a whit, because he didn't have the ancestral family line, nor did he have the ancestral lands that true Romans of the patrician or the plebeian stock had.
Well, if I was going to ask you, where would you both discern your value, or where would you both consider the most valuable aspect of from a personal, obviously, aspect as well, too, like for yourself, what would you consider more valuable if you had to look at the basic proportions of how a society runs? And then from a business aspect, obviously, we talk about the business aspect when it comes to Rome is a little bit more effective in that matter, only on a sense of they were more about, like, we don't really care about your feelings. It's a time to get stuff done because we have bigger things than just our lives. There's a bigger aspect to it, which I think leads in terms of why they probably thought about the underworld a little bit differently than Greece might. But Greece was more like, even though there might have been money, there might have been this idea of trying just to be able to survive. There was more of a bigger cusp of academics, which is where we start to see that start to get incorporated a little bit as well, too.
Yeah, I think I like the idea of, I guess, doing things for the benefit of the individual as well. That's for the individual. That's where you benefit. That's how you become wealthier. That's how you become healthier. It's how you thrive as an individual. But in societies, generally, they're set up where there's a lot of aspects that go against the individual, and it's more along the lines of benefits for the greater good, for sustaining a larger population. For example, like mass agriculture and food. I'm of the opinion that agriculture and providing, I guess, staple sort of grains and whatever else in the diet is going to lower an individual's health over time, as the nutrient density is going to be a lot less compared to if you were able to have more like a hunter-gatherer sort of lifestyle, where you had a bit larger range of food to call upon, but it's not very sustainable in a large civilization aspect. So
yeah, I don't see the Romans checking every person. You got a nut allergy? You got a nut allergy? I don't see that happening.
So yeah, it's you're balancing off the benefits of a larger society, but then also looking at thriving as an individual in that society as well. So I guess it's about trying to find that point. And I guess perhaps in Greek culture that may be a little easier to find. Again, depending what city you're in, but probably not Sparta. But yeah,
hey, leave Sparta alone. Yeah, no, look, Mark's right. I mean, just quickly, I've always found it strange. Like there's such a preponderance of celiacs or gluten intolerant people these days, and it seems to be becoming, more and more of a phenomena. Those people would have had no opportunity for survival whatsoever in ancient Greece or ancient Rome. It was the main food that you would have been consuming would have either been grain or barley in bread. So it would have had a lot of trouble in that regard. But I think as far as societal practices and things to esteem, I'd say that the Greeks probably had a handle on that. And look, the Romans were the great copiers, and they adopted a lot of things out of Greek society. So all of the doctrines of Stoicism and other sorts of philosophies that you see within Rome had their genesis within Greece. In fact, the Romans basically cut and paste everything they could out of Greek culture, except for the homosexuality. Not that it wasn't practiced in the Roman Empire, but it was one of those things that if you were a known homosexual in Roman politics, it could really, really hurt your political career. And Caesar's opposition used that that erroneous fact in particular to try and bring him down quite often. He was apparently a very attractive man, and there was a story that he had perhaps given sexual favors to the king of Nicomedia when he was a young man in order to get some ships for a navy that he was trying to raise to beat up some pirates that he was abducted by at one stage. It's a funny story, but I think if we were to pick values within a structural society, I'd say both myself and Mark would probably be on the same page, that the values espoused by the prominent Greek cities, the values of stoicism, of honor, of pride, of love of state, of city, I should say. It would definitely be something that I would probably try to bond myself towards, rather than the Romans could be incredibly selfish. Like they had hid behind a veneer of Rome, but those guys at the upper echelons of power, the senatorial class and the equestrian class, were very, very selfish individuals, and they'd sooner, stab you in the back and use your body as a corpse, as a stepping stone to get further along their political career. Whereas you don't, while the Greeks could be selfish in their pursuits, you don't see a lot of that individual selfishness. The city was a very important thing to each individual Greek.
So I guess I want to also hit on this point as well too, is that the value, we talk about values. For instance, I talked about your guys' value on when you're going to choose, or maybe what you would seem as more valuable compared to other aspects. Everyone has their own personal choice in that. But when we look at the value, for instance, of if being remembered, now, if being remembered was in both of these societies kind of constructs in a way, or a part of an aspect of what people wanted to aspire to be, not only on the concept of survival as well too, but being remembered, survival through history. We hear a lot about Romans' great wars and great aspects or military feats. And yeah, we still remember the culture that the Greeks gave to us, but Rome had more of an individualistic aspect of people to remember, great tales, great heroes. Now, we have some great heroes, obviously, and great philosophers from Greece, but there's more. When I was looking up the history, because I do love the religion aspect, but I like the military. When I was trying to look up Roman history or something like that, it just gave me military wars and battles that were fought. And then it gave in specific details the leaders of those battles. But if I look at like, what did Greece, what's Greeks history? It gave me more of a concept of like the literary and all these types of, and then the common names that everyone knows from Aristotle and then so on and so on. But there was more remembrance of Roman individual aspects, rather than with Greece, it's more of a broadband platform.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point, and I don't think I've ever quite looked at it like that before. But you're right. When you think about Rome, you're generally thinking about. No, you're 100% right.
I'm glad I gave you a new perspective.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it like that. I mean, Mark might have some interesting ideas on as to why, but you're right. Like when you're thinking about Rome, you're always thinking about Rome in terms of the great generals of the time. Occasionally great philosophers in the form of Seneca and other such people, I suppose, in the sort of more modern imperial Rome. But yeah, you're right. It's either it's Scipio Africanus, or it's Fabius Maximus, it's Gaius Caesar. It's always these great men. Whereas you often find yourself when you're talking about ancient Greece, and look, sure, there were some larger than life figures there, but by and large, you are talking about Athenians, or you're talking about Spartans, or you're talking about Thebans, or you're talking about those regions. And they definitely had, some some brilliant people to come out of those cities, but it was more the city as a person. I think that, I don't know what Mark's thoughts might be, but that might stem from the Greeks' idea that the city itself was a person, and the people within it are more or less organisms of that city. As I know that when they refer to civil war in Greece, they refer to it as stasis or stasis, and it is our word for stasis. It literally meant nothing going on, nothing happening. And for the Greeks, for a city to be in a state of stasis, it was a terrible thing, because nothing was developing. So the Greeks had that idea of centrality when it came to their cities. But for the Romans, it was all about, putting up a statue to yourself, like having a plinth inscribed with your dedication. So look, I don't know what the answer is to that, but I'd be interested to hear Mark's thoughts as to why.
So I guess a couple of, I think you're right with the city-state was the central idea in Greek society. But my understanding, so like with Rome, they were constantly expanding Roman lands, Roman territory. So there was constant military action that was taking place. And so it was kind of, I guess, like more of a martial sort of society in some respects, where you would earn great renown for great military feats. And they were always, probably every generation had their opportunities to engage in that type of thing. But in Greece, when you look at the city-states, their territories and their borders don't change for hundreds of years, basically. They all pretty much stay as they were, as their own independent ruling polis. So it was very different. I think that's probably one, like the structural element is probably one big aspect into that, where you're not expanding so much. So the martial aspect, whereas I think this probably goes some way into understanding a little bit into why Sparta was well renowned, and that's probably one exception in Greece, whereas Sparta was, had a much more martial sort of aspect to their society. But then when you look at how they developed, they expanded, they took territory, they took over a lot of lands. They're probably one exception where the Greek city-state from the archaic age actually expanded a great deal, whereas all the other city-states, when you look from the archaic into the classical, they're fundamentally the same. I mean, they control maybe more lands, but it's still, they're controlling other lands that become subject to them, perhaps through like the Athenian Empire and whatever else. But when you talk about the geographical, political boundaries, they don't really change too much. So I think that's probably one probably big aspect that may answer somewhat to that question.
Yeah,
Well,
great point.
a similar construct that we have today. I mean, what's more sexy? It's bread and circus. It's a show. And if you're talking about show, the military aspects of things, great battles that were fought, great wars, it's more appealing for someone to listen to. I mean, that's what they taught us in Greek mythology class, was not only the power of the gods, but also wars that were fought as well, too. And a lot of it happened to do with Sparta. A big concept of ancient history in a lot of my classes through school happened to do a lot with Sparta. Not even, and it barely touched on the aspect of, yeah, they were all kind of taken over with, but it was like more of like the accomplishments in their perspective. I think that's why 300 of a movie was so popular as well too. It's more barbaric, it's more brutal. It's what people like. They like to see explosions and they like to get drunk on a lake. That's what people like. So using the same word, because I feel like it kind of fits, I would say a sexy aspect is, which history would you say? Would you say not only the aspect of most beneficial when it came to a society standpoint, but more appealing to learn for a newcomer or a new listener? Would it be Roman or Greece?
Oh yeah, look, I mean, that's a tough one, isn't it? I mean, I think to touch on your first point, most people's entry into history comes through the great battles. I mean, Mark said that he'd read Polybius first of all, then Herodotus, and Polybius was a Greek who travelled with Scipio Africanus, I believe it was, and wrote heavily about the Second Carthaginian War, and obviously Herodotus wrote about the Greco-Persian Wars. And for myself, it was definitely reading, early Roman wars, the early Republican battles, particularly of dominance around Latium, which is the area around Rome, that dragged me into history. It's a tough one to sort of ascertain. I don't know. What are your thoughts, Mark?
Well, I mean, from a personal position, it's that's what drew me into history to start with, was more the military aspect, military side of things. I mean, and that goes with any time period. I mean, like I said, ancient history was kind of a bit later on where history came for me, but even in the modern history, it was like, World War II and things like that. And it was, you were interested in the wars, what was taking place. And I touched on Roman history first many years ago. And I think it was because of those aspects where you constantly got tales and different wars that you can read into. I think once you really delve into history and you get hooked on it, it's then the other aspects that start coming out that really start to really, I think, keep you there. And you find that there's actually so much more substance than just the military side of things. And I don't know if Steve could agree with this too. Maybe, as I find too, as you get older too, it's you start getting into these bigger ideas. You want to learn more about some of the ideas that were taking place, not just the it kind of feels like the military stuff is kind of just the sexy stuff on the surface, but then there's a lot more to really dig down into once you get hooked in there. So I think the military stuff is great for getting you in there, but there's a lot more to really keep you there.
Yeah, it's the garnish on the sides, isn't it? I mean, you're right when you say you start seeing the big picture when you really start delving into history. It's really a story of narratives, and I'm sure you experienced this as you started really getting into your Greek history, like from what looks like a loosely assembled collection of myths, fables, some facts, a little bit of storytelling here on the side. And once you start having it within your mind, you can start piecing it together as part of a broader narrative. And, for the ancient Greek side of things, right from the Bronze Age, with Homer's tales of the epic battles around Troy and things like that, right through the archaic phase into the classical era, there is a central narrative that underpins everything, where the Greeks had a, largely homogenous cultural and societal and religious element to their civilization that really ties everything in together. So I think, the wars, they suck you in because they're sexy. And that's what you want to see. And seeing as we're all saying the word sexy, I'll just keep on saying it. But it's definitely everything else that keeps you stuck into it. It's just a wellspring of information. And once you start getting a handle of it, then you can start grabbing stuff that's over there and you can start pulling it all together. And your viewpoint and your aspect of the history becomes, a lot more, I guess, high resolution, but from a really outward looking spot, you can really see a lot of it.
Well, so it's the iceberg narrative. You see what's at the top, and then you don't know what's down below. So Greece might have had a little bit up on top, but compared to how deep it really goes, there's more, I guess, depending on what your views or values are, which would depend on your age, obviously. If you're a young kid like me or you're a child learning about something, you want to see explosions, you want to see car crashes, you want to see all that stuff. But when you start boiling down to the aspects of how far did Rome's iceberg really go, is there a lot of deep evaluation or cultural stuff, or was everything kind of put up on top of the surface? And then it kind of leads into my bigger question. Who the hell is more, I guess, swayed to not write down certain parts of their history? When I look at a Greece aspect of things, I look at it like they're going to be 100% as accurate as they possibly can be with the information that they have. Rome's like, man, do we really need to include that in there? That's not going to show all our strengths. And that's a lot about what history is. I mean, if history is written by the winner, you start looking at an aspect of, you just want to show how big you are, show how badass you are. That's going to be remembered. You don't want to show all the little necessarily the flaws. And I mean, even if it comes to a homosexual act, or it might be good in today's day and age, even though it might have been a little bit differently viewed back then, there's still a concept of like, you had to do what you had to do. And that's kind of like a basic principle that still kind of underlies today as well.
Yeah. So,
It's another Robbie question.
Yeah.
I could rephrase it if you want.
Yeah, maybe rephrase that a bit.
When it comes to the iceberg of information, when it comes to maybe what looks, we just talked about being appealing for a lot of people, what's going to sway more people in. But when you really get down to the center, it's kind of like being, you end up getting the only option that's left on the table. And then you actually really appreciate this new flavor or this new option that you have, that you might choose it the next time as your first option instead of the one you've always chosen. It's kind of like trying something new.
Yeah, look, if I might, I think to answer that question, it's not simple, but I know what you're getting at. And look, on the surface, Roman culture and Roman history can seem, incredibly, multidimensional and very rich. And look, it was, to be fair. I mean, anybody out there that's passionate about Roman history will shoot me for even suggesting that it isn't. But by and large, it's the Roman true Latin civilization was very two-dimensional. They were very agrarian people. They believed in hard work and toil, and they were also extremely warlike. But outside of that, and you can see it in the languages as well, and the way that those languages were used within those civilizations. So you take High Republican, Late Republican Rome, Latin was obviously the speech of the general population and was the speech of government. But by and large, most of the great Roman authors and even their historians and their philosophers, they all wrote in Greek. They all copied Greek history. Livy obviously wrote Greek narratives. All of the great, like the Aeneid, for example, was really just taking off a section of Homer's Iliad and then writing a Roman narrative out of that. All of the great things within, I guess, all of the great cultural endeavors of Rome came out of Greece. So if there was an iceberg of a culture, it would definitely be the Greeks, because it's just so in-depth and multidimensional and multi-layered. It's like an onion. I think Mark mentioned at the start that you just keep peeling back the layers. And we at best might have half or 1% of the writings that were handed down to us, and we're still trying to, we're spilling a lot of ink just trying to understand the broader narrative of ancient Greek society. Whereas while there's a lot of stuff we don't know about Rome, in particular the earlier times, their culture was a little bit more sterile. It definitely wasn't, as rich and flourishing as Greek culture. I mean, the historians, take them for example, Herodotus and Thucydides. They knew precisely what they were doing when they were writing down their great narratives of the battles that were occurring in their time. They were literally inventing a discipline that, without those two guys, myself and Mark probably, wouldn't have the benefit of calling ourselves amateur historians in this day and age. The Greeks were very, very, very complex in their methods of trying to understand and interact with the world.
Yeah, and they did leave us, I mean, like you said, that we've only got a few sources that survive today. So, and this kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, Robbie, with the different, how like Rome or Greece or different city-states would present themselves, is we may have like one source to go off of, and we've got to try and work out what's really happening within it. And it may not be that they're trying to present themselves in a certain light, but in reality, there would have been many other writers as well, because not only would they be, say, in the context of a war, trying to present their city as a better, doing no wrong or whatever else, present them in the best light. On the levels below it within the city, you're going to have factions in different political elements that are going to be fighting against each other, which will then, perhaps they could have been writing that we may not, some may survive, but some may not, of what they were really trying to do. Were their policies really just or whatnot? So you can probably draw out a bigger picture, and you get more of this sort of picture in modern times. But in ancient times, I guess that concept gets lost because we've only got such limited sources to work with. And especially a lot of those sources all come out of Athens mainly. I mean, a lot of them, writers may not be Athenian, but they were in Athens writing and in the city. So I guess we got a more limited view to work with as well.
Damn, that just brought a thought into my head, is like, I wonder if there were ancient whistleblowers, people that would release information under a pseudonym or different perspective, just to make sure it's
like an Edward Snowden or something like that.
Yeah, because I mean, how much of fear, if there are these powerful forces knowing that you can be killed, I mean, as easily as I could sit here and talk trash to any of my politicians, and they're probably not going to care. And if I do get shot, it's probably going to be by CCP or Scientology or something like that. But it would be not as noticeable or not as like paper trail ridden when it comes to, you're in the same city, like, there's only a couple thousand people or a couple, whatever that you want to call it, in this place. If you're going to write something down or try and record something that's going to go through history, I would think that you would put it under a pseudonym or some type of whistleblower. I mean, I know there's ideas of Plato maybe being a pseudonym of like how writers would always have pseudonyms now. There's that kind of theory. Obviously, it's like a little bit of a conspiracy type thing. But you start looking at the grand aspects of things. I mean, the times weren't very acceptable. People, if you were on the cusp of science, if you were on the cusp of trying to understand things, if you had a perspective that didn't fit a religious narrative or fit the narrative that society was going off of, you were deemed as a crazy person that was either put to death or locked inside of your home. Hence Galileo. But I start to kind of boil down this aspect of things. If we talk about ancient whistleblowers, for instance, I wonder how much of it might have been swayed to a certain point that might not have actually happened. You know what I mean? Like, if you have people writing things down, if you choose to promote this type of thing, like a newspaper headline, you're not fully lying, but you can sure as hell blend the details.
Yeah, look. There you go, Mark.
I was just going to say, I think a big part of this too is it depends on, I guess, the standing that the whistleblower is in society. So the more influence one has in society, perhaps the more they're going to be listened to or being seen as a credible source. Whereas if you've got like we go back to ancient Greece, an everyday person that's trying to show what a high up person in the aristocracy is doing, they probably just go and try and fob them off, like they don't even bother listening to them. I think the aspects of trying to perhaps rid someone would be more in the lines of if it was another person of the noble class that was doing it. And another aspect too with the lower class is not, the lower classes weren't really writing. That was, literacy rates were not what they are today. And it was mainly the upper classes that would have education in writing and be able to perhaps get a message across. But I guess in Greece, you see, I guess, the beginnings of the attempt when democracy was starting to come about, I guess, at the end of the archaic period, where you have ostracism starting to take place especially in Athens, where political leaders would be often policies were decided on certain aspects where you'd have two sort of factions, and the leaders would go up for ostracism, where votes would go in, and whoever got the most votes would be exiled from the city for 10 years before they were allowed to return. And it was a good way of perhaps getting rid of. It was supposed to stop someone gaining too much power, but it was often used to try and get rid of political enemies at the same time.
Yeah, it's a really tough one. I mean, I can't think of any surviving source that would be labelled as a like an Edward Snowden, like somebody who spilled the beans on Emperor Augustus and got away with it. Because you've got to remember, in this day and age, like you steal some files off somebody's hard drive, you put it on the internet, then all of a sudden that's it. It's out there in the world. You can never get rid of it again. Whereas in those times, all somebody really need do is smash the stone tablets or burn the papyrus, and that's it. There's no more record of it. So the narrative and largely the history we have passed down to us now was probably the approved history, the popular history of its time. It's not to say that there isn't other narratives out there, but we've only received a very small portion of what was written down by the ancients, and that small portion was incredibly popular in that it was reproduced over and over again. So enough copies survived into manuscript form, and then with the advent of the printing press, was able to get more widely distributed from there. But I can think of, just for an example of I guess a popular view that we had of somebody that changes when we get different sources. When I was up until I was about 2022, the Emperor Claudius was always considered a bit of a bumbling idiot, quite the hedonist and a fool, I guess, for the women in his life. And if you look at the history as it stands, with what you can see in front of you, he certainly does appear that way. But there was a stone tablet that was uncovered in Alexandria about 15, 20 years ago now. And it was basically a letter that Claudius had dictated to the prelate of Alexandria. And the prelate had asked him a question, obviously, around a dedication to a temple there. And he'd asked Claudius, how big do you want your statue to be? Should we gild the statue? Basically asking for some money of it. And Claudius had written back this beautifully eloquent letter, basically saying, look, there's no need to venerate me any further. I'm your emperor. Spend the money on, public works around the city and feeding the poor. And that discovery has largely changed most people's viewpoints of the Emperor Claudius. So look, were there whistleblowers in the ancient times? Absolutely, there would have been, but we don't really see any of it surviving in the record, because it would have been just too easy to, as Mark suggests, just do away with those people, off with their heads. And the Romans were famous for it, especially when there was interfactional fighting towards the close of the Republic. The proscriptions was the term that they used. They'd hang thousands of names up on the rostra outside the forum every day, and those people were all slaughtered, for merely having a different political ideal to the popular one at the time.
Do you think that without, let's say if we took Rome, for instance, if we looked at, I know we talk about how there might have been reformed Greece roots and a lot of their culture came from Greeks. Do you think that attributes to their success, or do you think that maybe they would have been more successful if they would have just had their own style of things? Because if you have literary and elementary, I would say, education when it comes to Greek art or culture, but if your personality doesn't, we don't see people that are all about themselves driving a broke car. We see them driving Ferraris, or we see them that was a reference to when I said the Ferrari in the beginning. I'm all about myself. But you start examining, maybe they were using the wrong vehicle for their personality. It didn't fit their character. It didn't fit who they are. Maybe if they were all about how their personality was, which was all about war and all about power, they might have developed a more successful culture where everything doesn't boil down to the basic argument is they still take things from the Greek. I don't think they necessarily perfected it or made it better, but I think that's also why we remember them, is because there are subtle notes of what we also go off of today, because that stems from Greek. And then if we look at Greek culture, for instance, would they have done better if they were more Roman? Or do you think their only tribute to success was maybe a concept of the time that they were in? There wasn't, there's a time period gap, So maybe their success, if you try and place it in Roman times or maybe a little bit more present, would they be even more successful? Would people like this more ideal of this culture that we go by, or would it be seen as crazy? I mean, maybe if we look at the flat earthers today, I'm not one, but if you look at them, maybe it would have been easier back in the day, but today is different because there's more information, there's more of an outlet. Maybe the Greeks would end up be considering the weird ones or the cast outs in a way, and not everything we built society off of. This is obviously a skeptical kind of thought. It's not based in any historical evidence.
I think, well, purely culturally, I guess the Greeks are the great survivors. I mean, most of our, Western democracies and architectures, the arts and all that, they stem from ancient Greece. But if you look at it like as a society, as a civilization, with the Roman conquest of Greece in the 2nd century, at the Battle of Pydna, I guess it was probably the last, true Greek resistance to Roman dominance. You see Greece basically fall under the dominion of other powers for the next 2,000 years. And it's not until the 1830s, barely 200 years ago, when the Greeks were able to shake off, finally Ottoman rule. Whereas Roman civilization, for better or for worse, it had relatively around about 2,000 to 2,100 years of relative survival. If you look at the birth of Rome in 753 BCE, the mythical birth of Rome with Romulus and Remus, down to the fall of Constantinople in 1454, I think it was. That is the extent of the Roman Empire, because although it was Byzantine in Constantinople, Constantine the 14th, I believe he was the last emperor of Constantinople. He instructed his soldiers, when the Ottomans were coming to siege the city, to die like good Romans. So the Roman spirit, especially their martial spirit, was very much alive for the better part of 2,000 years, whereas the Greeks, because they weren't unified in the same way the Romans were, they divulged into infighting and petty bickering, really, which really bled the spirit of their people and left them a broken carcass for the Romans to come in. And to be fair on the Romans, they largely rescued and saved Greek civilization. If it wasn't for the Roman domination of Greece, we probably wouldn't have a lot of those works that we rely on now, because the Romans brought them into Rome and then promulgated them from outside of the empire after that. So on a physical level, the Roman Empire was much more enduring. Spiritually, culturally, the Greek, for sure.
And I think Rome would have obviously taken the Greek aspects when it was absorbed into Roman civilization, but a lot of it was Romanized as well. So it became, even though you can see the roots of it as being Greek, but a lot of it would be brought into Roman civilization in their context. So a lot of the stuff would be Romanized and Latinized and whatever else to be relatable to their population. And it's the same thing that would have happened with the Greeks earlier when they took on certain aspects of Babylonian different ideas and Egyptian ideas. There's seen as the roots there, but they made them Greek and they made them their own cultural aspects as well. So I think even though, and it evolves over the hundreds and hundreds of years, where it becomes something different. So it's very hard to then just sort of pinpoint it to one spot, because it's always constantly evolving, and different generations change how culture is viewed as well. So I think it's very difficult to pin down and I guess say, would they have functioned better without it or whatnot? I mean, it's a hard one to say, but
I'd almost say that, like, you probably we probably wouldn't have, without one or the other, we probably wouldn't have either to speak about now.
Yeah. I mean, the Greek culture was taken on board with Rome, and it kept it alive for like another 1,500 years. So, who knows if Rome hadn't come along and taken along, what would have happened to many of those ideas? What would have happened?
It's one of those what if questions. We get them all the time too. Like, who would win on the battlefield? Like, people love to compare, the armies of Alexander the Great versus the legions of Caesar. But they themselves were 300 years apart. So, like, to get into comparisons, it's very, very tough.
Would you consider, in your perspective, both of you, as carrying on kind of a legacy or carrying on a cultural foundation, or would you consider it on taking what's yours, or taking it maybe a concept of preying on the weak or the ones that aren't looking like it's going to last, because they could have easily just crushed it and then left that society's culture there and adopted their own and made their own foundation of it and then had that last. But they chose to adopt it. Was it seen because it was a weak structure that you could be like, well, it's already here, so might as well use it? Or was it an idea of keeping on because they still have some basic good aspects of this thing that we could use to help better our future?
I think I think the ultimate motivation is selfishness. So you're looking for what's going to benefit you in the long run. And they would have recognized certain ideas and systems. They go, well, this is perhaps better than what we've got, and we could make it work in our society, and it would benefit us greatly. I don't think it's as much of an idea of we need to preserve this civilization or society. I mean, you've got probably very minor people, like aspects of people in a civilization that would think that way, but I think the real reason it would be absorbed or taken on in a civilization is purely for their own benefit.
So is it an anthropologist perspective that's connecting the dots of that they pulled it from a lot of their culture from Greece based on the time periods that they're just like, oh, it picked off from this or that? Because you would think that if the Romans wanted to be known for their culture, for their aspects, you wouldn't want to know that you copyrighted or you stole somebody's stuff and you're using it as your own. You would make sure you would try and delete any of that history that were possible. So then that would go back to the theory of a whistleblower that would extend that forward, unless people anthropology wise are drawing lines, historians are drawing lines to be able to say that we pulled it from the that Romans pulled it from the Greece.
Yeah, we've got the sources. I guess the sources can basically give you a timeline of where ideas perhaps developed and came from, and it can be seen as being absorbed into other civilizations.
Yeah, definitely. And you can even see it. I mean, take the poetry, for example, like the Latin, or I guess the very early Italian epic poetry had its own meter. I think it's called pentameter. So it had five bars per foot of the rhyme, whereas the Greeks always traditionally had, especially the epic sense, had the hexameter. Whereas once Rome became more aligned with Greek culture in the 3rd century, they lost that pentameter. And not that we only have fragmentary evidence for their epics that were written in that time frame, but it's a clear change from pentameter to hexameter, because they were trying to align themselves with the Greek history and the Greek epic ballads that have gone before. And Greek history, or to the Romans, so the prehistory of Rome, the Greek history in that time was every bit as much Roman as it was Greek to the Romans, at least. Anyway, the Romans were the great pragmatists of their era. They took whatever they could find, wherever they could find it. If it was beneficial to their culture, they'd absorb it. And I don't think they were shy about it at all. They were quite proud. I mean, at the end of the day, to be Roman was to be a ruler of the known world, and they weren't shy of the. I mean, their marketplace, for example, was a shrine to all of the enemies that they defeated. All the different trophies that were set up there. I mean, they had the beaks of ships from other opposing navies that they defeated at sea installed on there. Like they knew where they got a lot of their things from, but they still considered themselves to be superior in that they were able to absorb it at the end of the day.
So through your guys' podcast journeys through this different sides of history, whether we're bringing it into Sparta as well too, Steve, so we're not forgetting Spartan History Podcast, but through your guys' kind of information and your perspective as well too, is there anything that you've really kind of thought differently of than before you started the podcasting journey, or not? Yeah, before you guys started the journey through history on it.
Yeah, look, sorry, Mark. Personally, I had no idea how confusing Spartan history would be. I mean, I had a pretty good understanding of most of the sources, and I had a fair idea of what the narrative was. But in trying to pass out that narrative and partition it off into individual episodes and really dive deep onto the different facets of Spartan culture and civilization, my God, if I had known this 2 years ago, I would have quit and happily sat back and listened to Casting Through Ancient Greece podcast and got my history that way, because it's definitely been a very confusing journey for me. So I've learned a heck of a lot since I've started down this road.
Yeah, same thing. I mean, I've read quite deeply on Greek history before even starting the podcast, but once you really get into, I guess, writing scripts and episodes, for other people to understand. So you truly need to understand what you're writing about and trying to get across. And this is, then you start encountering ideas that seem contrary to perhaps what you originally thought. So you have to dive a bit deeper in certain aspects. When you just look at like the Greek and Persian wars, and it looks fairly straightforward, but then you start getting down into, like I said earlier, you've got this infighting because of different interests within the Hellenistic League, the league that was formed. There's so many interests at play that you're trying to untangle what was happening here. Why were they wanting to do this when it seems like this was a better option? And again, you're trying to untangle some of the sources, but then also fill in the blanks, because there's a lot of blank spots when it comes to the sources. So yeah, I mean, when you're really trying to understand it, to bring it to other people, that's where the challenge really starts to come in with a lot of, I think, the history with Greece.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think we both probably got we've got the bug now, and I know that I've spoken to Mark at length in the past, and we both had similar reasons for wanting to get into podcasting. We had an absolute, an undying passion, I guess, for Greek history. And, if we can, bring, even a handful, hopefully more people, into the love and admiration of that history and that culture, then, we've probably done what we've set out to do.
I think,
and that was,
yeah.
I was just going to say that was, sorry, I was going to say that was my biggest motivation was, a lot of people don't really know all that much about Greek history apart from, the movie 300 or something. And that was my whole motivation, was to create the series where I could hopefully bring it and put it in an accessible form, but also keep it interesting for people that had an idea of Greek history, but still be able to take them on a journey that dealt with some of the deeper issues at the same time.
Well, you guys give a more interesting perspective, I would say. I mean, I listened to 15 episodes of Mark's last night, and then I was like, well, it's time to listen to some Steve, even though I've already listened to Steve before, but Steve's got hour something long episodes. But you guys have different views and perspectives, even though you guys are talking about the history of things. It's just done in a different format, which is basically, when you watch the History Channel, yeah, the guy has a nice voice, sure, and there's some pretty pictures that go along with it, but there's also not really diving down into specifics when you guys kind of narrow down each category of this is this part of this time period. And it's good content too. You can always get more and more content from it as well, but it's more specific and more individual. I'm not even going to try it. It's more
individualistic.
Yes. Good job. Thank you. But it kind of boils down to like what I was mentioning in the beginning of too, is that I rarely ever do a double podcast, but there's synchronicity here. I mean, we barely talked over each other, and at times we were more than happy to let the other person speak ahead of time. And I think that just shows, like, I mean, that's kind of what we need in this kind of podcast world as well too, but also in the history subjects as well too. When I listened to your guys' collaboration episode, I think I listened to the one on Mark's and I listened to the one on Steve's, but you guys talked about like, hey, we're both doing kind of the same time period of history podcast. We might as well get to know each other and then might as well collaborate with an episode. And that's important because it's kind of showing like an olive branch in a way, even though when you're studying, I mean, maybe you brought that way because the whole entire idea of studying that history is all about war and all that. So it's like, hey man, we need some peace. I'm getting a little depressed over here. But there's a concept of more of a unity and a synchronicity. And this episode, in my opinion, couldn't have gone any other better of a way.
No, it was fantastic, Robbie. It was great to be on. And yeah, look, you're 100% right. Like myself and Mark have far more in common than we'll ever have, in difference. So, if I know that he's been a great help to me over the time I've done my podcast, and I hope I've been a help to him. And, we're at the end of the day, our goals are exactly the same. And look, your broader goal of, bringing people together and just having discussions and letting people have their chance to talk and, really canvassing all different sides of people's, mentalities, emotions, thought processes and all that's just fundamental. I mean, this is just such a great thing to be able to be a part of. So I'm truly honored to sit down with you two gentlemen.
It's been great to be able to do this sort of thing. And I don't think Steve and I have ever probably even the thoughts crossed our mind that we're in competition with each other either. I found even with other historical podcasters, I find it's good to talk with them. I learn more myself as well. You look at different, different aspects that you probably haven't thought of before, and they can help drive your thinking on some other areas that you may not have thought of exploring. So it's all just great help. And yeah, myself and Steve started around the same time, I think too. So it's just been we came across each other, and it's been a great sort of journey to sort of share together as well.
I hate to say the words, but we're definitely gonna have to do another 3-way podcast because it was a good learning experience. So like this, the main thing I wanted to highlight, it wasn't a debate or anything. It was more of a exchange of ideas and different perspectives through two people and me from an outside perspective of questions to ask. But it was more of a Greece side and then more of also with Rome history as well too. Because Steve, even though you do a Spartan History podcast, you had a good insight on this as well too. So I'll make sure I link both of your guys' podcasts and links to this description. It's Spartan History Podcast and then Casting Through Ancient Greece. They're amazing podcasts. They're some of the ones I'm subscribed to on Apple, Spotify. Should I say all your listening platforms that you can view it as well too. And then hopefully we're going to get you guys doing some nice video too, so we can get the